The Kia EV6 is one of our favorite electric cars here on Chasing Cars, and that's because, like the Porsche Taycan, the EV6 actually doesn't make a big deal about being electric, despite its name. It's actually just really good to drive no matter what fuels it. Now, this one is the top of the tree, the EV6 GT, which has just landed in Australia this week at a price a hair under $100,000 before on-road costs. This one, painted moonscape matte, is 103 grand before costs. So you're looking at about 110 drive away. That's one expensive Kia. And in today's video, my question is really, can they justify charging 6 figures for this EV6 GT? Bit of a spoiler alert is this car is probably much better to drive than you might expect. But the GT's biggest problem is that the GT-Line is already so good, and it's 13 grand cheaper. So, can you justify the jump? Kia Australia is expecting plenty of people to do just that. They're thinking hundreds of Aussies are going to line up to buy this car in the coming months. 2,200 EV6 sales projected here for 2023. Will they pull it off? Let's find out by making a start inside, so hit subscribe down below. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. It's expensive, but at least the EV6 GT comes fully optioned for Australia with summer tyres, matrix LED headlights and a standard sunroof as well, really turning it into a GT car, grand touring. This isn't really meant for carving up racetracks, it's more meant for quickly making progress across broken up Australian country roads, which is why it has a bespoke suspension tune. And you'll be comfortable as you do that, partially because you're sitting in some really great seats, the best seats you can get on any EV6. They are bucket seats, they're a completely different seat to the standard car, and one of the consequences of that is that the EV6 GT is actually unrated by ANCAP, because when you change the seat, it actually changes all that stuff about whiplash protection and whatnot. But what I can tell you is that the seats are very, very supportive, but they're also quite contoured and narrow, so I would recommend trying out this car before buying it if your frame is much bigger than mine. But I've been very happy for a few hours driving this car in these seats today. They've got Alcantara, or Dynamica I should say, and they've got neon green accents matching the brake calipers and matching the GT button here on the steering wheel, which Kia says is perfect for closed tracks like this one in Victoria, whereas the sport drive mode is really what they've tuned in for country road use. The steering wheel, broadly the same as in the regular EV6. We've got the neon green stitching as well though. And then looking further afield, you've got a very similar dashboard to the GT-Line, same sort of detailing on it. You've got two 12.3-inch screens. They're easy to use, still no wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, but you get some unique GT graphics as well, some soft materials, but on the whole, the interior is not luxurious or even that premium. It's just serviceable, comfortable, and the ergonomics are all really good. You've pretty much got what you need in here. Some notable omissions: no cooled seats. Unlike the GT-Line, they're only heated, steering wheel's heated as well. But you do get a Meridian sound system with surround sound. It's pretty middling in my opinion. It sounds okay, but not as good as in some other vehicles at this price point, especially the Model Y, which has a superb stereo. The back seat of the EV6 is really spacious in terms of legroom. That seat's in my driving position. It's pretty much limo-like back here thanks to the huge wheelbase on this car. Tow room, it's a bit of a problem. These manually adjusted front buckets get super low, and so it does impede your toe space a little bit, but headroom is absolutely fine. Now, unfortunately, the eGMP platform, which sits underneath this car, doesn't have a cutout in the battery structure for your toes in the back, so your knees are a little bit high, but it's certainly not as bad as the Polestar 2 Performance that I had as my long-termer. So if you just splay your legs slightly, you'll be comfortable back here. There is a fifth seat in the middle. You've got vehicle to load capability down there and also on the exterior of the car, so you can send 3.6 kilowatts of power to another device like a fridge. I personally have had a barista coffee made by the power of an EV6, so anything's possible. And we've got two USB-C ports here in the back as well, plus air vents in the B pillars. Hard plastics on the doors feels quite cheap at over 100 grand drive away, but they have concentrated on the mechanicals rather than the premium fittings in the interior. These seats feature the same suede-like finish as up front, and while we don't need it today, given that it's summer in Australia, the back seats also have two-stage seat heating, just like those in the front. The rear end is, in my opinion, the EV6's best angle, and it's pretty difficult to tell a GT from behind. You've got a GT badge, very similar to the GT-Line badge, except it doesn't say Line, and there is a unique diffuser, but it's subtle, and Kia tells us they were going for a sleeper aesthetic with this car, which I love. Now we've got a power tailgate, and that opens up really promptly to reveal the same size boot as other EV6s. It's not the world's best boot because you've got so much vertical space cut away because of the sort of coupe aesthetic of this SUV, but it's fine. It's got plenty of space. You've got a sun blind here. Nothing under the boot floor, no spare, so instead you have a tire mobility kit. So keep that in mind if you do lots of touring on really rough roads. Hopefully nothing goes wrong. I've got a button up here to close that tailgate. And the last thing we're going to talk about before we go for a drive is how much range this EV has and how much energy it consumes. When it comes to charging, the EV6's secret weapon is its 800 volt architecture that lets it charge at peak speeds of about 240 kilowatts. Kia talks a lot about 10 to 80% in 18 minutes. In our experience, that's pretty much right, but you're going to have to subscribe to watch my independent range and charging test, which will come to the channel later. Now, speaking of range, that's actually a bit of a weak spot for the EV6 GT as it declines from 484 kilometers in the GT-Line all-wheel drive to 424 kilometers here, which is a decent hit, although you are getting all that extra performance. With a 74 kilowatt hour usable battery, that's giving you consumption of about 17.5 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks. I got about 20 today, so that's a range of around 350 kilometers. Not great, not terrible. You can let me know down below if you can live with that. Warranty, 7 years unlimited for the car, 7 years, 150,000 kilometers for the high voltage components, and you can get a service plan for the EV6 GT. 7 years will set you back around $2,000. So this is the real test of the Kia EV6 GT, an Australian country road, because if you go and read all the European reviews, they love this car, but it's been specifically tuned for the European market with a very, very firm suspension, and that's fine over there because the roads are actually really great. But here in Australia, our country roads are typically not super well maintained, and I don't mean to completely generalize about Europe because it is a bit mixed, but Germany's a massive market for this car and German roads are usually awesome. Less so in rural Australia, but Kia Australia and its engineering team has done so much work to customize the EV6 GT for our roads and our driving styles and tastes, and that's involved tuning work in Germany, in Korea, and lots here in Australia as well. And so we're really getting our first taste of what those efforts have been able to achieve here in regional Victoria. And I'll start by saying this car really is quite something. The underlying EV6 is already a really impressive product. I'm a big fan of the GT-Line rear-wheel drive spec of the EV6. That's a really nice balanced car, not too powerful, and really good ride and handling. And of course, we're right up the other end of the spectrum here in the GT. Not only is this dual motor all-wheel drive, which you could already get in the EV6, but we've got a bespoke rear motor in this car, 270 kilowatt rear motor. Total outputs of the car are 430 kilowatts and 740 Newton meters of torque. It's a double inverter at the rear. The motor can turn it up to 21,000 RPM, and that's what gives the GT a top speed of 260 kilometers per hour. Not especially relevant here in Australia, though I'd love to have a crack on the Autobahn in one of these in future. At the front end, interestingly, we've actually got the rear motor from a Genesis GV60 repositioned at the front of this car, and that's how it's got pretty high power from the front end as well, but it is a rear biased system, and that's certainly the way it feels out on the road because you've got more push than pull when you're coming out of a corner in the GT. Though I would say in most situations, unless you're getting right into the depths of the throttle pedal travel, it doesn't feel outright that much quicker than a GT-Line all-wheel drive in terms of roll-on acceleration. It's actually the punch off the line which is most clear, and the claim is 3.5 seconds 0 to 100, but I actually think that's not that important for this car. What the EV6 GT is all about is actually its ride and handling on the move, and this is one area where the existing EV6 was already doing pretty well, at least in terms of ride quality and compliance. It's just superb. but the GT improves the handling in one major area, and that's the steering. The steering feel is so much better in the GT. First of all, it's got an Australian tune of the electric power steering, but the hardware is also quite different. We've got a variable steering ratio, which means it turns more tightly as you add lock, and so that makes the steering feel quite quick. But we've also got mechanical differences in the steering system at the front end, which is granting us more feel and more response, and you can really tell that on the move. The normal EV6, because of the pandemic, didn't get an Australian steering tune, and its steering is really not one of its high points. That will be fixed in an upcoming facelift, but for now the GT has notably better steering. But the composure, the body control, the demeanor of the car is just as sweet, if not a little more so, than the other EV6s we've also tested quite a lot on the Chasing Cars channel. It's a really impressive package, and that would be the case if it was an EV or not. But what about its EV characteristics? Well, you can drive it in a one-pedal drive mode, you can reduce the regen braking entirely, and even if the regen is turned off, the brake pedal is still blending regen and physical brakes, much like a Porsche Taycan, and it's very convincing with the smoothness and the manner in which it does this. And that actually reduces brake temperatures for track use, meaning you've got more of the real brakes available to you if you do need a really big stop, which is pretty cool. And Kia claims the stopping distance is about 2 meters, less than that of a GT-Line all-wheel drive. We'll be testing that at the Chasing Cars test track in due course, as well as the 0 to 100 time. Now, of course, range could be a little bit better. Consumption's definitely higher than the regular EV6, so if that's the goal, go for the GT-Line rear-wheel drive, which is a really good, long-range, efficient variant. You take a big hit, mainly because of that bespoke rear motor in this car, but it's, you know, the payoff is obviously much bigger performance claims, which is going to matter to some people. Impressively, it's actually a really refined vehicle. There's much less road noise than you'd expect, even on coarse chip roads. It's really serene in the interior. Visibility is pretty decent, and the safety systems are really well tuned in this car, with excellent lane keep assist in particular. While I think the GT does sacrifice an element of total compliance compared to the GT line, the stability is worth it for drivers that genuinely want to push on, as opposed to people that just kind of want a GT badge for the sake of it. This car's hardware and tuning are so good that you really should tap in to those capabilities. And then there's things like the ELSD on corner exit, which the other models don't get, the GT does, and that just lets you put the power down more effectively, and you know, that makes a difference. I think what's interesting though is the upcoming Hyundai Ioniq 5N, which will use similar hardware but is a much more track-focused vehicle than the EV6 GT, which is more about quick use on country roads, which many would say is more relevant for us here in Australia. But it's when you get to a genuinely challenging bit of road where it's really bendy and you've got a lot of mid-corner bumps that the GT separates itself out from the GT line, but also from a whole bunch of other EVs that typically don't manage their usually gargantuan weight very well. The Kia does. It's not a light car by any stretch, but of course we do have a low center of gravity, blah, blah, blah. All EVs have that. It's actually the suspension tech and how the car manages the weight that matters. And this is where the GT's bespoke suspension, it's a adaptively damped setup in this car, plus the Australian tune really comes to the fore, because the body control is just superb. And when you encounter those mid-corner bumps, the car's line is retained with integrity. And that's where this car starts to remind me of something like a Porsche Taycan Cross Turismo or Sport Turismo, which is a high compliment because that's the best driving EV on the road. So those are my impressions of the new Kia EV6 GT. My favorite part about this car is, much like the Porsche Taycan, the EV6 GT stands alone as a great performance car, electric or not. If this thing had a petrol engine in it, we'd just be as enamored as it is. But of course, with that high output rear motor, the bigger front motor as well, it's capable of some pretty astonishing performance figures. But like I said at the start of the video, the EV6 GT's biggest enemy is the existence of the GT line, which is really great and probably about 85% of this car's goodness for a lot less money, with the caveat that the GT has much better steering, though we hear the GT line is in for a steering tune upgrade in the coming years anyway. So if I were you, I'd consider buying the GT if you actually are going to tap into that crazy straight line speed, and also the drift mode. That's unique as well. Well, those are my opinions. You're welcome to disagree down below in the comments. Leave me your feedback down there. Hit subscribe. You can catch my full written review on chasingcars.com.au as well. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.